B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's May Day, International Workers' Day, Friday, May 1st, 2020. Joe Biden has broken his silence on the sexual assault allegations brought by former Senate employee in his office, Tara Reade. And it's a pretty forceful denial on the part of the former vice president and presumptive Democratic Party nominee. He went on the Morning Joe show at MSNBC with Mika Brzezinski presiding over the interrogation. And I think that Biden performed pretty well for what he was intending to do. He didn't equivocate. He didn't offer one of those measly apologies of, if I offended you, I'm sorry. As you'll hear in a moment, he just says it never happened. And it's interesting because on Twitter this morning, my first blast of this interview was from a partisan who had pulled a clip that I did not see in the 17-minute exchange between Mika and Joe. And it appeared that he was dumbfounded at one point and he simply could not answer a question. And I watched the entire segment very carefully, and that didn't happen. Maybe it was in a subsequent segment. I will give you that benefit of doubt. And let me be clear about my own bias. I've been skeptical of Joe Biden since I was a witness in the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings before the Judiciary Committee that he chaired, which is in the same time frame, about 1992-93. Well, let's see. Clarence Thomas was appointed by George H.W. Bush, so that would have been in 91. 93 is the date that Tara Reade gives for her, what she called an ugly encounter with her boss, Senator Joe Biden. But in the Clarence Thomas hearings, I was so turned off by this guy. And the white males who joined him on that committee, who were so afraid of this African-American man that George H.W. Bush had appointed, saying he was the best qualified to sit on the Supreme Court. And they could not confront Bush's lie and flatly deny Clarence Thomas confirmation based on the merits. And so they drummed up the Anita Hill case, and in that exchange, Joe Biden, I think, discredited himself in many ways. Then he went on to champion the Len Bias crack cocaine law that, in a manner of great disparity, sentenced blacks who dealt crack to much longer sentences than whites who dealt coke. And as his career went on, I found many issues and positions of Biden that I took exception to. Notably, his cheerleading, not just one of those people who said, I'm voting to give Bush the authorization to invade Iraq because it's the best way to prevent war. That's what Hillary said, and many other Democrats who fell in line did the same. But as University of San Francisco professor Stephen Zunis has chronicled in articles that he wrote during the recent Democratic primary, Joe Biden silenced critics, peaceniks, and others who opposed the ill-fated invasion and occupation of Iraq, and he marginalized them in favor of a parade of people who supported W's stupid plan. And since then, he has been deceptive about that. He claimed he, was just barely involved in the bankruptcy bill that he championed and was co-sponsor of, and that Elizabeth Warren ripped into him for during the recent debates. So, yeah, I have a bias against Joe Biden. Let me just put it right out there. And I think that he may fall into the presidency if Trump falls out. But I'm highly skeptical of his viability and electability in the current environment, despite the fact that he is enjoying good polling against Trump right now. And I have shared with you the accusations that have come from Tara Reade. I have blitzed the corporate media for its failure to investigate and publish anything about it until after Biden was safely the only candidate left in this huge Democratic primary field and Bernie Sanders had bailed out. And I'm still a little bit unhappy at Bernie about that. But as I watched his interview with Mika Brzezinski today, I felt that he did himself a pretty good job. He has been failing lately. He appeared to doze off when Hillary Clinton gave a riveting endorsement of his presidential campaign just the other day. And a lot of his verbal failures and some of the malarkey comments that he's made, his combative stance with primary voters that he met in Iowa and elsewhere, I have found a lot of reasons to criticize Joe Biden. And this is not to say that I am dismissing the claims of Tara Reade. But from a purely objective or attempted objective perspective, Biden was even-handed, saying that she deserves to be heard, but ultimately the truth is what matters, and he stood quite firmly in his denials. Now, I will note that Mika Brzezinski used the standard NBC approach, acting very aggressive, very tough. And she came at him from 6 different angles about whether records of Tara Reade's complaint that she says she filed before she left his employ in August of 1993 that did not allege this sexual incident, but did allege inappropriate behavior toward Reade by Senator Biden. And she went back and forth saying, well, you know, you've got your Biden papers at the University of Delaware. Why won't you open them up? And he says, well, if there's any personnel matter, it would be in the National Archives in my Senate files. And she did create the impression that he might be hiding something in those University of Delaware files. His explanation is, well, look, I'm running for president, and somebody could grab a comment that I made about Russia or a policy position I took, and it just doesn't make sense to serve that up for people to use or abuse. And that's fairly logical, particularly if you already support Joe Biden. But in that NBC style that reminds me of the old Tim Russert, the late Tim Russert, and today Chuck Todd, they ask these tough questions and then they peel off. They either don't follow up on the evasions of their guest, or they just change the subject. And today what I noticed is that Mika didn't ask about the various credible witnesses or people who Tara Reade told her story to over the years. And like many sexual assault accusers, Tara Reade's account suffers from some inconsistencies. The fact that she had praised Joe Biden online back in 2017. And then she joined a group of women last year, a total of 8, I think, who complained about inappropriate behavior, you know, the hair sniffing, the shoulder rubs, the excessive compliments that Biden would lather on. But she didn't come forward with the assault claim until this year. And as someone who has never suffered a sexual assault, I decline to place full judgment on the way women respond and the times and degree of detail that they offer and when they actually go public with it. And as you hear in a moment, Caitlin Johnstone's riveting column, where she reports her own incidents of rape, we have learned, and through the Harvey Weinstein trial, many of his accusers continued to see him because they thought it was good for their careers or for other reasons. And yet the jury did find grounds to convict him and send him up the river, essentially for life. So let's listen for a moment to some of the comments that Joe Biden made this morning. I'm a little frustrated because the MSNBC website will not let me skip through the interview, fast forward and stop. It's just start and go. And so here is the end of one of Brzezinski's questions at the very beginning of the interview, where she recited the accusations of Tara Reade and got Joe Biden's first answer.
Go on the record with the American people. Did you sexually assault Tara Reade?
No, it is not true. I'm saying unequivocally, it never happened. And it didn't. It never happened.
So that was the essential statement that Biden repeated several times throughout the interview, which runs about 17 minutes. And if you care to, you can find it over at NBC, MSNBC.com, and you can listen to it at your convenience. So he went on to variously say that it didn't happen. He declined to suggest her motives. He didn't say that she's being used by other people. And I think he was very well coached. After all, he has maintained silence on this since she surfaced in March with the more explicit claims of sexual assault. And so this is going to leave us with a he said, she said situation. Now, Reade has finally received invitations from many major media outlets, the networks and the cable channels. I believe she's going on Fox on Sunday with Chris Wallace, but we're told that other programs and other networks have finally reached out to her. And it was just yesterday that I was reciting the weird account in the New York Times by Ben Smith, criticizing all of these MSM outlets, the corporate media, for declining to hear her out, without, of course, criticizing his own New York Times. So I continue to criticize the Times for its very weak journalism in this case. But in today's account, written by these same reporters who wrote the original piece that was published on Easter Sunday, Lisa Lehrer and Sidney Ember, they do acknowledge how this interview is coming late after weeks of indecision about how to respond publicly. And they compare it to Trump, and that's fair. Trump has been accused of dozens, including suggestions of raping underage women at fancy parties, and some that may have included the late and notorious Jeffrey Epstein. And he has managed to just deny it all. And to be fair, Biden is a little bit more forthcoming by finally facing some of these questions. Now, he did say that he's never, ever asked anybody to sign a non-disclosure agreement. There are no NDAs, period, in my case. And as I say, the real sparring came over whether he should reveal his, or at least allow a search of his papers and records over at the University of Delaware. He has said that he wants the National Archive, which would hold the personnel records from his time in the Senate, to identify anything from Tara Reade and make it public. And he said he's very confident that there's nothing there. Well, this could unravel on that point singularly. But in the meantime, he's been accused, he denies, and we'll hear more from Tara Reade shortly. I also have to say that over the course of the Me Too movement, I have raised concerns about false accusations. And I hold to the rubric of American criminal justice that you are innocent until proven guilty. And so at this point, I reach no judgment or conclusion about this case. BuzzFeed News, a couple of reporters, Rosie Gray and Ruby Kramer, appeared to have lengthy discussions this week with Tara Reade, and I've linked to their report in the show file for today's podcast. And Reade acknowledges that she is in a spotlight. The heat is on her, that this is a difficult situation. And by the way, she doesn't watch television. So she said she often has to look up some of the characters who come forward to either embrace her story or denounce her. And she has said in a series of interviews this month that she has felt marginalized, smeared, discounted, betrayed by Democrats she said she once admired. Quote, "It was really devastating when Kirsten Gillibrand and Stacey Abrams and Hillary Clinton all on the same day just basically implied my story wasn't true and they believed Joe Biden. I can't describe to you what that felt like," she said. And she describes herself as a lifelong Democrat, in particular a fan of Stacey Abrams, the former Georgia House Minority Leader who lost her run for governor when it was clearly stolen from her. Reade said, "I'm stunned. I'm stunned. They didn't just say, oh, we're standing with Joe Biden until we hear more. They just discounted me. They marginalized me. They said they didn't believe me. I can't tell you." She said, trailing off, "I cried for a while because they're important in my life. They've been figures that I looked up to." Now, there have been efforts to smear her, which I find cartoonish and ridiculous, because I don't care what her views are of Vladimir Putin with or without his shirt. And to try to link her to Bernie Sanders because she clearly supported him in the primary, and then triangulate that to include Bernie Sanders' so-called appreciation for Russia because he spent his honeymoon there. That's just a joke, and it undermines the claims of people like some prosecutor who was in USA Today yesterday and his articles being passed around by Biden supporters as there are holes in her story. And one of the good things that Brzezinski did was press Biden on his public support for Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. And because she was accusing a Republican Supreme Court nominee, it was very safe for Biden to believe Blasey Ford. And I do have to say that it's hard to take at face value people who are partisans for Biden, who supported Blasey Ford and now say that, this is a political setup. Tara Reade is not credible. There are holes in her story. Why didn't she say last year that it was sexual assault? There are all kinds of these questions that can be raised. So next, I recommend that you read the entire commentary that Caitlin Johnstone has posted today at consortiumnews.com, and I'm sure you can find it on her own website. And she opens by citing Stacey Abrams. I saw her on television the other night with Don Lemon on CNN. And Stacey Abrams recited the talking points that BuzzFeed published and we covered earlier this week. And Stacey Abrams said that the New York Times deep investigation of Tara Reade's claims, which did not include the recent corroborations of two women, one a former neighbor of Reade's in Morro Beach, I think it is, on the California coast. Her name is Linda Lacasse. Nor did Lemon we didn't hear about these corroborators from Mika Brzezinski today. The other woman is Lorraine Sanchez, who worked on a state Senate staff with Reade for a couple of years. Back to Johnstone, Lemon did not ask why Abrams considers the Times the official arbiter of who was and was not raped. He didn't challenge her false assertion that the Times concluded Reade's accusation was not credible. He did not point out that the investigation by the Times took place prior to the emergence of the corroborating evidence. In reality, she says, and she's right, the Times did not conclude that Reade's accusation is not credible, only that they found no pattern of sexual misconduct by Biden, beyond the hugs, kisses, and touching that women previously said made them uncomfortable. And Johnstone notes, as we earlier reported, that the New York Times modified, they edited without notice a certain line that was offensive to the Biden campaign. So back to Johnstone. I've never been in the always believe all women camp. It's a narrative that's too easy to manipulate once you get enough people believing it. But at this point, there are two possibilities. Either Tara Reade was going around lying to her closest confidants in the 1990s with the very long-term goal of one day thwarting Biden's third presidential bid decades later, or B, a powerful man sexually assaulted a woman. One of these, in my opinion, is a lot more probable than the other. And here's where she gets personal. I've been avoiding writing much about Tara Reade for a lot of reasons. Firstly, I'm a survivor of multiple rapes, and it brings up a lot of ouch for me, especially since whenever I write about rape as a problem, I always get a deluge of highly triggered men and sometimes one or two highly traumatized women calling me a man-hater and saying all kinds of nasty things. Secondly, I've been trying not to spend too much time on the details of an election we all know is fake anyway, between two establishment candidates we already know are deeply depraved. But mostly I avoid the subject because it's just so goddamn gross. It's gross to watch liberals going around pretending they believe that handsy Uncle Hair Sniffer would never dream of shoving his fingers into a woman without her consent. It's gross watching the language of leftism being borrowed to defend pure, relentless victim smearing. It's gross watching people who built their political identities around pretending to care about women try to spin these allegations as Reade being dishonest for partisan reasons, when in reality, that's exactly what they themselves are doing. And she says, it hurts. There are definitely a whole lot of rape survivors experiencing the same thing about this story right now. Nobody wants to have their name dragged through the mud by widely esteemed mainstream news media outlets. Nobody wants to have their entire past and social media history dug through to find anything that can be spun in the most negative light possible. Nobody wants to be told over and over again that they're a liar, that they're crazy, that they're confused, all because they know they were sexually assaulted and said so. Nobody wants what can easily be the most traumatic experience of their life turned into a weapon to bludgeon them before jeering crowds of millions all around the country. And that sucks. Then she gets personal. I was 19 the first time I was raped. The last time I was 39. I never reported my attackers for reasons the specifics of which I'm not interested in explaining or defending. But let's just say there are many messages you get sent by society telling you that if you report your rapist, you are ruining a man's life, destroying his family, career, and future over one mistake. Caitlin Johnstone. I hope you'll give it a good read. Well, as I mentioned at the top, today is International Workers' Day. And as we reported earlier this week, many employees of Amazon, Whole Foods, Target, and other companies that have been accused of mistreating their workers, either with low pay and working conditions or, more recently, inadequate protection from exposure to the coronavirus. So, before we dive into their protests, I want to share a little with you from the latest video with the beautiful potty-mouthed woman who anchors it. I don't know her name. This comes from Australia. And thanks to my boat builder buddy Mark for sharing this with me. It came in yesterday at a time that I could really use it. This is their latest send-up of what they call the machine and the pandemic. It's called Honest Government Ad.
Hello, I'm from the government with an update on the pandemic. As you know, in order to flatten the curve, we've had to turn off the machine. The machine has not been turned off for a long time. Nobody even remembers who turned it on. So please bear with us as we consult the manual after pricing it from the shitted pants of capitalism and figure out what to do next. While we wait, we thought we should have a little chat about what just happened. Scientists had been warning us for decades to prepare for this crisis. Did we? Of course not. The machine said there was no profit in preventing future crises. So instead, most of us opted for an alternative policy. Total fucking panic, dead people and bullshit. Here at the Chinese government, this meant covering up the virus and deaths, disappearing truth tellers, arresting activists while no one's watching, making up conspiracies, making the WHO our bitch, and then trying to cast ourselves as the saviors of the world. Here at the British government, where we spent the past decade bankrupting the NHS, this sentient ham caught the virus and almost died of irony as his life was saved by the migrant nurses we've been blaming for unemployment. In Europe, we care about unity, so we turned our backs on the Italians and said cazzi vostri. In Brazil, where our fascist fuckchop still thinks it's just a flu, we left it to street gangs to protect the favelas. In India, we stoked violence against Muslims by blaming them for the virus. In Poland and Hungary, we gave up on democracy. In North Korea, we slipped into a coma. And in Belarus, we told you to drink vodka and left you to crowdfund your own healthcare. Fajna i normalna. But nowhere has our policy been more evident than in backward countries and failed states, like the US. Here, as thousands of people died and got buried in mass graves, Il Duce left you to fight each other over medical equipment by entrusting it to his little shit goblin-in-law.
All right, I'll pause it here. I do recommend you watch it and watch the video because the images are so powerful. It is an amazing production with a lot of heavy editing and great graphics, and it might brighten your day before you realize how accurate it is and you start to cry. So back to International Workers' Day. The walkout began after Amazon ended its unlimited unpaid time off policy for workers at the end of April. Here's a Amazon employee, maybe a soon-to-be former one, in Staten Island, New York. The fact they took it away prior to the sick-out lets you know they're aware of the sick-out and trying to stop people from participating in it. Now they're forcing people to go to work because if you run out of unpaid time off, that's it. You're fired. The protests at Amazon occurred after Amazon began providing personal protective equipment to workers and enforcing social distancing rules and temperature checks. But Palmer said that cleaning procedures remain inadequate. Then a woman who's worked for Target in Massachusetts says, I'm participating because the company has not designed or enforced adequate protection for its workers. And here's a woman who's worked at Target for 28 years. There is no support from Target corporate. What we want to do is make the point that we're humans, we can get sick, and we are not just pieces of a machine. I think that's the same machine that our friendly potty-mouthed woman was talking about a moment ago. So yesterday in Lansing at the state capitol in Michigan, there was another mini-mob that showed up. No masks, no physical distancing, many of them heavily armed. And did you know that it is legal to carry weapons into the state capitol, including, if you're permitted, into the Senate and House chambers? And so Trump tweeted that, the governor of Michigan should give a little and put out the fire. He should make a deal with the demonstrators. Now, how do you make a deal across the table from armed nutballs? And we know, of course, that there are angry people, but much of this is astroturf generated by the same forces that funded the Tea Party 10 years ago. And it has grown to become a credible movement because the media keeps covering it. And I do understand we have friends and family in Michigan, and some of the regulations there seem a little bit too much, like you can't go out fishing on your boat. Now, in Michigan, it's not nearly as summery as it is here in California right now. But still, to tell people you can't go to your own second home, whether it's a hunting cabin or a cottage on a lake, I understand that people chafe at those restrictions. But after losing a relative to the coronavirus in Detroit early on, I'm much more sympathetic to Whitmer, who often gets called Whittler by her opponents. And in the, hotbed of conservatism here, what we call behind the orange curtain, Orange County, which is just south of Los Angeles, Governor Newsom chose to close the beaches only in Orange County this weekend. They are completely off limits. He's calling it a hard close. And the rest of the state, you can't park near the beach, but if you can hike in there, you're allowed to go to the beach if you're not seen to be there in large numbers or too much of a crowd. But, of course, the right-wingers in Huntington Beach on the city council last night voted to seek an injunction against the governor's order to close the beaches in Orange County. And Newsom said specific issues on some of those beaches have raised alarm bells. People that are congregating there that weren't practicing physical distancing, that may go back to their community outside of Orange County and may not even know that they contracted the disease, and now they put other people at risk, put your hospital system at risk. But it was a 5-2 vote on the Huntington Beach City Council to seek an injunction. And I picked up that story from the LA Times, and this is a heart-wrencher that was on the front page of the Times this morning about a 32-year-old African-American nurse, Brittany Bruner Ringo. And she had been hired about a year ago at an upscale dementia care center in Los Angeles. And in mid-March, she was told to process in a new patient, a retired doctor who'd flown in from New York City, despite the fact that the facility was under lockdown. And she called her mom, also a nurse, and I think her grandmother was a nurse too, and said that this patient had profuse sweating, a huge cough, and a fever close to 103. And Mom said, that's a problem. And so within a day of his arrival, the doctor was so ill that Bruner Ringo called 911. They transferred him out of there. He died the next day. And 63 residents and employees came down with the virus. 9 have died, and one of those was Miss Bruner Ringo. And before she went on a ventilator, she told her mom she wanted to blow the whistle on this, but she never had the chance. Here's today's COVID-19 update, assembled by Linda Lewis with my gratitude. Worldwide, we now have an estimated 225,000 deaths attributed to coronavirus. Here in the United States, the number has crept up to 62,000, as reported by the CDC. And Linda takes us first to Japan, where the northern island of Hokkaido is again in lockdown after a second fiercer wave of infections followed lifting of the first lockdown 3 weeks ago. It lasted 3 weeks. And one of the medical experts there says, now I regret it. We should not have lifted the first state of emergency. And I hope this is not repeated in the United States. I'm chafing under the lockdown. We have another 30 days to go here in California. Oh, you can play golf now, and there are a few other minor relaxations of the rules. But most people can't work. The kids are at home. It's getting warm. You want to be outside. You want to go to the beach. But I am persuaded that if we lift it too soon, we will regret it. Next up, Linda tells us, and this is something I have been pushing since the Secretary General of the UN proposed it. The 15-member Security Council may vote as early as this week, or next week, I guess, on a resolution that demands an immediate cessation of hostilities in all countries on its agenda and calls for armed groups to engage in a 30-day ceasefire. The Trump administration has thrown up roadblocks, including an objection to any language supportive of the World Health Organization. Yeah, that's much more important than a global ceasefire. It just shows how petty and political. And I don't believe that the U.S. really embraces this anyway. But it is a step in the right direction. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has belatedly drafted a 17-page document detailing guidance on how businesses, schools, churches, transit, and other organizations should safely handle reopening to the public. Little late on that one. Linda gave me the link to that, and I'll throw it up in the show file for you to take a look at. And there's also a much more critical report from the Center for Infection Disease Research and Policy, and they have announced a series of articles designed to provide planners and the public with straight talk on topics like testing, contact tracing, supply chains, and more. In their report, they advise risk communication messaging from government officials should incorporate the concept that this pandemic will not be over soon and that people need to be prepared for possible periodic resurgences of disease over the next 2 years. And Linda provided the link for that report. I will include it for your perusal as well. Well, with some 30 million people officially unemployed, many others in the cash economy who don't show up in the statistics, a wave of self-employed and independent contractors who were first allowed to file this week, there are many workers still waiting for unemployment checks. In Arizona, Florida, Indiana, Minnesota, and South Carolina, 98% of unemployment applicants from March are still waiting for money. And I've seen just a smattering of friends on Facebook who have gotten the $1,200 paper check with Donald Trump's name on it or a direct deposit of up to $1,200 in their checking accounts. But it has been painfully slow. While the corporate bailouts, that money just flowed out of there like greased lightning. Bloomberg is reporting that the Trump administration is organizing a, quote, Manhattan Project-style effort to develop a coronavirus vaccine. It's called Operation Warp Speed, aiming to produce 300 million doses of vaccine by January. It will pull together private pharmaceutical companies, government agencies, and the military. Now, of course, we know that experts say that a vaccine to be properly tested and rolled out is going to take 12 to 18 months. This is more blue sky coming from Trump and his administration. And like others, I have my own concerns, skepticism about the safety of any vaccine that is rushed. Trump has announced that he has finally recognized that after more than 5,000 deaths in nursing homes, that maybe we ought to pay attention to that. He read a statement that somebody wrote for him. My administration will never waver in its relentless commitment to America's seniors. We owe them a sacred and unbreakable obligation. We'll fulfill that obligation with every resource and power that we have. And there's $81 million from the CARES Act to increase nursing home inspections. Other measures include a requirement to report coronavirus cases directly to the CDC. There's been a lot of gamesmanship on, even here in California. It took them weeks to reveal to us that 40% of the deaths are occurring in retirement communities or nursing homes. And that pattern is unfortunately happening statewide. Even here in Marin County, where we have a large retired community or population, we know that 5 people have died in senior facilities, but they won't tell us which ones or the names of the people who have passed away. I don't know why those games are being played. At the White House Thursday, Trump was asked by a reporter, have you seen anything at this point that gives you a high degree of confidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the origin of this virus? Yes, he said, I have. Yes, I have. And I think the World Health Organization should be ashamed of themselves because they're like the public relations agency for China. Asked to clarify that, he said, I can't tell you that. I'm not allowed to tell you that. And we'll get to claims about Wuhan and the virology center there coming up shortly. And Linda adds some important more philosophical or, broader looks at disasters. She says the human response to a disaster typically has 6 phases: threat, impact, heroic, honeymoon, disillusionment, and reconstruction. The phases can vary in duration, are well known to disaster responders. The honeymoon phase is characterized by unity and gratitude for life-saving efforts that took place in the heroic or emergency response phase. It's also a time when survivors are hopeful, optimistic of getting assistance that restores them to wholeness. And this is coming out of the February issue of Frontlines in Psychiatry. But where a government lacks the financial means to provide resources for severely impacted citizens, they say, a honeymoon phase may not occur because a sense of despair is never alleviated by the influx of meaningful assistance. She says that sounds very much like the present situation for Americans under lockdowns. It doesn't bode well for Trump and other incumbent politicians because it means Americans will move quickly to the next phase of disillusionment. We now have identified more than 4,000 workers in meatpacking plants who've tested positive for the coronavirus, and at least 115 meatpacking plants are affected. 20 of those workers have died so far, and a number of the plants have been shut down, but Trump has ordered them to get back into the slaughterhouse business. And without being, snarky, are these slaughterhouses for animals, or are they becoming slaughterhouses for humans? And by forcing people back to work or risking their jobs and their income, we're putting a lot of risk onto those people just so we can have our cheeseburgers. Now, today is the big day that Texas is not wide open, but it's widely open. Governor Greg Abbott is rolling the dice because yesterday they reported in the Lone Star State over 1,000 new cases, and the death toll for the past 3 days is the deadliest stretch since the state's first fatality back on March 17th. 3 days, 119 people. And the testing continues to lag. They've administered only 330,000 tests for a population of nearly 30 million. And local officials in Texas are urging residents to be cautious, to resist the reopening. Here's a Dallas County judge, Clay Jenkins. Just because something can be open doesn't mean it should be open. And just because something is open doesn't mean you should go there. It sounds pretty elementary, but I think some people need that reminder. And Abbott said that he sent his reopening plan to Dr. Deborah Birx, and that she told him the Texas plan was great. Then Linda focuses on something that's near to my heart, and that is the fate of people locked in state and federal prisoners along with local jails at this time. Now, to my knowledge, and in many cases, the local officials have responded better than state and federal. They have released people early, declined to take new prisoners, and tried to modify their populations to the extent they thought was safe. But Vice News is reporting that the president of the union that represents correctional officers at the Federal Medical Center Carswell in Fort Worth sent an April 7th letter to their senator, John Cornyn. The letter included whistleblower allegations that the Bureau of Prisons knowingly misleads the American public about conditions and was taking a cavalier approach to quarantine that put staff and inmates at risk of contracting the coronavirus. And we'll come back to another federal institution in a moment. But the final item in Linda's report today is about Reality Winner. You know her, the 20-something who was a whistleblower and I believe was burned by The Intercept, who essentially, in trying to confirm the document that she leaked, gave the government the evidence they needed to convict her. She is also locked up at Carswell, that we mentioned a moment ago, in Texas, and on April 10th, a motion was filed on Winner's behalf in district court requesting compassionate release. The judge denied her request at the behest of the prosecutor who convicted her in Georgia, U.S. Attorney Bobby Christine. He said that the prison where Winter is held has taken appropriate measures to screen both staff and inmates, and that she's going to be just fine. Now, the other facilities out on the East Coast in Brooklyn, that's the Metropolitan Detention Center, and The Intercept reports that there are many people incarcerated there with the coronavirus, but there's been very little testing. They only have something like 15 test kits, and they haven't used very many of them. And the report also argues that officials there have been shredding the paper reports they get from inmates complaining that they have symptoms and requesting a test. It's kind of obvious, but I think it's worth underscoring. A White House memo from New York Times reporter Peter Baker notes that Donald Trump doesn't have much compassion, doesn't express much of, comfort to people who have lost loved ones in this pandemic. Indeed, Trump appears reluctant to talk about the more than 62,000 people who've died in the United States from coronavirus. He mentions a few times that a friend of his, Stanley Chera, a major New York real estate developer, had been infected and later died. In response to a question this week, the president said that he'd also lost a few other friends and had spoken with families of other victims, but quickly shifted the conversation to distance learning for children. He did have one moment where he said, "I don't think anybody could feel worse than I do about all the death and destruction that's so needless. Nobody." Other than that, he's pretty much compassion and empathy free. Now consider what I'm about to tell you in a larger context. This comes from the British Guardian newspaper. Lead, scientists working for the U.S. military have designed a new COVID-19 test that could potentially identify carriers before they become infectious and spread the disease. And where is this coming from? DARPA. Now, they famously invented the internets that enable me to deliver this podcast to your earbuds or speakers. But I think it's a little suspicious that so soon in this pandemic, they are reporting a blood-based test that will be able to detect the virus's presence as early as 24 hours after infection and before people show symptoms several days before a carrier is considered capable of spreading it to other people. Now, DARPA is not Fort Detrick, but they got the same boss. And we know that Fort Detrick, the weapons lab that helped to spread or at least is thought to have helped introduce us to Lyme disease. We know they developed other bioweapons there over the years. And we know that from the great book called A Terrible Mistake, that one man committed suicide because he was so burdened with what he knew about the use of LSD, tested as a truth drug. So the United States has a long and dark history of bioweaponizing, and it's fascinating that our media never considers that or mentions it. And the idea that DARPA is all ready to roll out a test that would be, more advanced than what we have now. Well, I think it raises questions, and I'm willing to ask them. All right, to counter this, we have a report today from Live Science, and they are flatly saying that nobody knows where the virus came from, but they know that it didn't come from the Wuhan Virology, the Institute of Virology. And on this is dated April 18th, the vice director of the WIV, that's the Wuhan Institute of Virology, said there's no way this virus came from us. We have a strict regulatory regime and code of conduct of research, so we are confident. And they quote Gerald Koish, associate director of the Boston University National Emerging Infectious Disease Laboratories. Based on no data, but simply a likely scenario that the virus went from bats to some mammalian species and spilled over to humans, he said, well, This spillover event may have happened before the virus found its way into a live animal market, which then acted as an amplified setting, blah, blah, blah. So I prefer to believe that we don't know. And I'm even-handed here. It may have come from Wuhan. It may have come from Fort Detrick. It may have come from elsewhere. After all, the most deadly zone in the United States is New York, and it's pretty well established that that was introduced from Italy and not from China. And the first apparent death in Santa Clara County that occurred in February here in California has not been traced to anyone who traveled to or from China in the recent past. So I've linked to this story, and you are free to read it. Again, we'll continue to ask the question and see when some reasonable and credible answers actually surface. So Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, has identified a need of about $1 trillion to bail out states and local government. And I haven't run the numbers, but compared to what we've given out already, it seems fair enough to me. Problem is, the House, what is it called? The attending physician of the House of Representatives counseled against reopening the House starting this coming Monday, the 4th of May. So Pelosi quickly shut down plans to do so. And now Democratic senators and some Republicans are challenging Mitch McConnell's plan to reopen the Senate as early as Monday. And we know that McConnell's plan is mostly to confirm young, conservative, inexperienced judges to lifetime appointments on the federal bench. So we'll see how all that plays out. Turns out that some outlets, media outlets, that actually fit the criteria for the Paycheck Protection Program have gotten money from it, like a free weekly in Burlington, Vermont, 7 days. They've been able to keep their 50-person staff mostly intact. They did temporarily lay off 7 employees, and 5 have gone back to work after they got a loan for $450,000. The Times-Picayune in New Orleans, Newsday in Long Island, Harper's Magazine. Now that's interesting because I've met the publisher there, Rick MacArthur, and he is an heir to the infamous MacArthur fortune that funds the Genius grants. But also the embattled McClatchy newspaper chain, originally from California, they're not eligible for the loans because they have too many employees. But it does seem that some of this money, Mother Jones has qualified for a loan, and the nation has applied for one. So I don't really object to some lefties getting a little money out of the federal government at this time. This raised some eyebrows for me. Earlier this week, we talked about this Israeli company, I think it's called NOS, and they're in a lawsuit with WhatsApp. I'm sorry, it's the NSO group. My apology. I got those letters jumbled. So they're in a lawsuit with WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, over the hackability of the purported end-to-end encryption that WhatsApp offers. Well, it now turns out that the current FBI director, Christopher Wray, who is demanding that WhatsApp and other encrypted media services give a backdoor to the FBI. It was only a couple of years ago when Chris Wray was on the payroll of Facebook and WhatsApp defending their encryption. His latest position is that we have to have mechanisms to allow lawful access to protect flesh and blood Americans. But just 2 years ago, when he was at the law firm of King and Spalding, he was arguing the other side of that case. Canada has announced after the deadliest mass shooting in its history that it is introducing an immediate ban on military-style assault weapons. Justin Trudeau, quote, these weapons were designed for one purpose and one only, to kill the largest number of people in the shortest amount of time. There is no use and no place for such weapons in Canada. Benjamin Netanyahu is going to be allowed to try to form a government despite his delayed trial for corruption, which is set for May 24th. Now, the prosecutor in the corruption case is the Attorney General, Avichai Mandelblit, and he personally issued the indictment against Bibi. But he has said that Israeli law is silent. It does say that lower-level government ministers can't stay in office while they're under indictment, but it's silent on the prime minister. So, green light for Bibi, at least short term. And also related to Netanyahu, yesterday, my long-term friend, Gareth Porter, published a piece at the Gray Zone showing that the Israeli government fabricated documents that they said came from a raid on a warehouse in Iran that claimed to show the nuclear program of Iran, and that Netanyahu used these fabricated docs to persuade Donald Trump to bail out of the six-nation nuclear deal with Iran. It's worth reading. I've linked to it in the show file at peterbcollins.com. Now, just a week ago, we posted the fabulous, if I do say so myself, interview with Pepe Escobar. And as you know, he's an international journalist, but he grew up in Brazil and still has close ties there. And at the end of the podcast, he told us about the disintegration of the Bolsonaro government. Two of his sons are being investigated for corruption, but that happens to everybody there. And Bolsonaro is fighting for his political survival after Sergio Moro, who was the car wash prosecutor who helped in the rise of Bolsonaro, turned on him and accused him of criminal behavior in seeking to appoint a national police chief who would be his personal legal beagle, dish up dirt on his opponents. And then it's his denial about coronavirus. And it's interesting that the New York Times is confirming just about everything that Pepe told us last week, including the rise of military leaders in the Bolsonaro government. And, of course, it was a military dictatorship there for 18 years, ending in the mid-'80s. And something like half of the Bolsonaro cabinet is made up of military figures, including the vice president. Here it is. Active and former military officials currently hold 9 of the 22 cabinet positions. And the VP, retired General Paulo Chagas. Oh, let me take it back. This is another general. I get him confused. The vice president is Hamilton Morayo. But this guy, Paulo Chagas, who has run for office but is not currently in government, said that I think this is the best government team we've had in 30 years. However, the vulnerability of the government is its own leader who's perpetually giving ammunition to his adversaries. And it was the Veep who said to journalists, don't worry, everything is under control. We just don't know whose control. Also, because of the weakness of the government and the risk of spreading the coronavirus, all of Brazil's neighbors are setting up efforts to try to shut the borders or limit transit of trucks and freight because they feel there's nobody in charge in Brasilia. And Brazil-based Glenn Greenwald has a new video report over at The Intercept. I haven't watched it yet, but I've read his teaser. And he basically talks about the 3 different threats, which are the virus, the threat of impeachment, and the potential rise of a new military government in Brazil. And finally, at Mint-Press News today, Alan McLeod reports that exactly 1 year since Juan Guaido attempted a coup in Venezuela, he's trying it again. It appears he's using the same tweets and the same tactics. Quote, "Today I speak to the patriotic soldiers of our armed forces who rebelled against hunger and destruction and sided with the Constitution. To the majority of patriotic soldiers who are still in each branch of the armed forces, today, more than ever, there are obvious reasons for them to act and support the formation of a national emergency government. We are going to liberate all of Venezuela." But McLeod points out that even his former supporters have turned on Guaido, despite the fact that the Trump administration essentially handed him $342 million that had been frozen from the Central Bank of Venezuela's Citibank account. And he's using it to pay his supporters $5,000 a month, which is a princely sum in Venezuela. Guaido is as unpopular as he ever has been inside the country, even among the opposition who removed him from his post as head of the National Assembly in January. His own party, Voluntud Popular, has also expelled him from their ranks. He's even unpopular among his fellow coup plotters. And when he returned to Venezuela in February, he touched down at Simón Bolívar International Airport in Caracas, where enraged crowds of travelers and even airline employees began hectoring, jeering, and manhandling him, dousing him in water and less sanitary liquids, shouting that he was a traitor and a fascist. And McLeod says the incident was unironically described across Western media as Guaido being greeted by a throng of cheering supporters. Thanks for listening to my news and comment podcast. You can share it all over the dang place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.